Commander Lyra stood at the edge of the Galactic Council's Grand Assembly Hall, watching the circus unfold before her with the kind of detached amusement usually reserved for watching toddlers argue over playground rules. The vaulted ceiling stretched impossibly high above, its crystalline surface refracting light from a dozen different star systems, casting rainbow patterns across the faces of beings that had crawled, slithered, or floated their way out of every corner of the known galaxy. And they were all staring at her. Well, not just her, technically. They were staring at humanity's entire delegation, which, in a stroke of bureaucratic genius that would have made Kafka weep with joy, consisted entirely of her. One human, representing a species of 8 billion souls. Because apparently, the Galactic Council believed in the sample size of one approach to interspecies diplomacy. "The human will step forward," announced Secretary Plymouth, their chitinous form clicking and whirring as they shuffled papers with appendages that looked like they'd been designed by a committee of spiders having a particularly creative day. The insectoid's compound eyes glittered with what Lyra had learned to recognize as barely contained anxiety. Poor thing probably hadn't slept in weeks, assuming their species actually slept, instead of just hanging upside down or whatever it was they did. Lyra pushed off from the wall where she'd been leaning, because why stand at attention when you could make a statement about humanity's casual confidence in the face of cosmic bureaucracy, and strolled into the center of the chamber. Her boots clicked against the polished floor with the kind of measured cadence that said, "I'm here, I'm human, and I'm not particularly impressed by your fancy light show." The assembled delegates rustled, chirped, gurgled, and made various other sounds that the universal translator cheerfully converted into a low murmur of anticipation. To her left, a delegation of crystalline beings that looked like living chandeliers chimed softly against each other. To her right, something that resembled a cross between an octopus and a philosophy professor writhed thoughtfully in a tank of purple liquid. But it was the figure directly ahead of her that commanded attention. Counselor Vexitar rose from his seat with the kind of theatrical grandeur that screamed, "I practiced this in the mirror." The reptilian's scales caught the light, shifting from deep emerald to gold as he moved, and his eyes, those cold, calculating orbs that had probably seen the rise and fall of civilizations, fixed on her with predatory focus. Oh, the irony. "Human," Vexitar began, his voice carrying the weight of authority and just enough condescension to make clear where humanity stood in the galactic pecking order. "Your species seeks membership in this august assembly. You wish to join the ranks of civilizations that have proven their worth through millennia of achievement, wisdom, and—" He paused for dramatic effect, forked tongue flicking out to taste the air. "Evolutionary superiority." Lyra nodded politely. "That's the general idea, yes, though I have to say, your definition of millennia of achievement is pretty flexible if it includes the Zephyrian trade wars. What was that? 300 years of fighting over the rights to export decorative crystals. A ripple of what might have been amusement, or possibly indigestion, passed through the assembly. The crystalline delegation clinked together in what their translator rendered as nervous laughter. Vexitar's eyes narrowed, which, on a reptilian face, looked about as menacing as you'd expect. "Indeed, the human demonstrates the casual arrogance that concerns this council. Your species has existed in space for less than a century, yet you presume to understand conflicts that shaped the galaxy before your son was born." "Before our son was born?" Lyra raised an eyebrow. "Counselor, our sun is roughly 4.5 billion years old. Either your understanding of stellar formation needs work, or the Zephyrians have been really, really committed to this whole crystal thing. More ripples of sound from the assembly. Secretary Plymouth's clicking intensified, which Lyra had learned was their species' equivalent of nervous sweating. Vextar's tail lashed once, a gesture that, according to her briefing materials, indicated either extreme irritation or the reptilian equivalent of touché. Your words demonstrate precisely why this council harbors reservations about humanity's readiness for membership. You lack respect for your betters. Oh, I have plenty of respect, Lyra said, clasping her hands behind her back in a pose that managed to look both military crisp and utterly relaxed. I just save it for beings that have actually earned it. The silence that followed could have been cut with a knife, assuming you had a knife specifically designed for cutting cosmic tension. Plymouth's clicking reached a crescendo that sounded like a Geiger counter having an anxiety attack. Vexitar's lips pulled back to reveal rows of teeth that evolution had clearly designed with intimidating the hell out of smaller creatures as the primary objective. Very well, human. Perhaps it is time to demonstrate whether your species possesses the qualities necessary for galactic citizenship. And here it comes, Lyra thought, maintaining her expression of polite interest while her mind began running through contingency plans. She'd been expecting this moment ever since her arrival 3 days ago, when Plymouth had nervously mentioned that the Council had prepared a small demonstration of worthiness for the human delegation. "The Council," Vextar continued, his voice taking on the tone of someone about to reveal a particularly clever trap, "has decided that humanity must prove its understanding of the natural order. Specifically," his pause here was so dramatic it probably deserved its own musical accompaniment, "your species must demonstrate its relationship with the apex predators of your world." Lyra blinked once. "I'm sorry. Could you repeat that? The acoustics in here are terrible, and I could have sworn you just asked us to demonstrate our relationship with apex predators." "Indeed. You will bring before this council the most fearsome predator from your homeworld, the creature that sits at the very top of Earth's food chain, the being that your species fears above all others." Vexitar's tongue flicked out again, and Lyra was fairly certain she detected smugness in the gesture. "This will allow us to judge whether humanity truly understands its place in the cosmic hierarchy." The assembled delegates began making their various species-appropriate sounds of approval. The crystalline beings chimed like wind chimes in a hurricane. The octopus philosopher gurgled what sounded like applause. Something that looked like a sentient gas cloud pulsed with colors that the translator helpfully rendered as enthusiastic agreement. Lyra stood perfectly still for a moment, her face a mask of thoughtful consideration. Inside her head, however, a very different conversation was taking place. They want Earth's most fearsome predator? Oh, this is rich. This is absolutely deliciously rich. They think they're being clever, these scaled bureaucrats and chittering committee members. They probably spent weeks planning this little test, convinced they've found the perfect way to humble the upstart humans. "I see," she said finally, her voice carrying just enough uncertainty to make Vextar's smile widen. "And you want us to bring this predator here? To this chamber?" "Naturally. How else can we properly assess its fearsome nature?" Vextar's tail swished with what Lyra recognized as anticipation. "Unless, of course, humanity lacks the courage to face its own world's apex predator." The challenge hung in the air like a gauntlet waiting to be picked up. Around the chamber, delegates leaned forward with the kind of eager attention usually reserved for particularly entertaining executions. Lyra let the silence stretch just long enough to make everyone uncomfortable, then nodded slowly. "Very well, counselor. I accept your challenge." She paused, and something that might have been a smile flickered across her features. "When would you like me to present this fearsome predator to the council?" "Tomorrow," Vextar declared, clearly savoring what he believed to be his moment of triumph. "At the height of the galactic day cycle, when all delegates can witness humanity's educational experience." Perfect. Lyra's smile widened just a fraction, and for a moment, something flickered in her eyes that made several of the more observant delegates shift uncomfortably in their seats, tanks, or hovering platforms. "I'll need to make some preparations, of course. Ensure proper containment protocols." "Of course," Vextar agreed magnanimously. "We wouldn't want any accidents." The way he said accidents made it clear that he was hoping for exactly that. A human torn apart by their own world's apex predator would send quite the message about humanity's place in the galactic order. Lyra inclined her head in a gesture that managed to be both respectful and somehow threatening. "Then I shall take my leave to prepare. Thank you, counselor, for this opportunity." She turned and walked toward the chamber's exit, her pace unhurried and confident. Behind her, the delegates erupted into excited chatter, chirping, and various untranslatable sounds of anticipation. Only a few beings noticed the way her smile widened as she reached the doors, or the soft chuckle that escaped her lips as they sealed shut behind her. In her quarters, waiting patiently on a cushion beside the viewport, Duchess stretched and began grooming her orange fur with the methodical precision of a creature that had never doubted her own perfection. "Well, girl," Lyra said, hanging her uniform jacket on the back of a chair and scratching behind the cat's ears. "Looks like you're going to be famous." Duchess purred and continued her bath, utterly unconcerned with the fate of galactic diplomacy. After all, she had more important things to worry about, like that spot behind her left ear that was proving particularly challenging to reach. The door to Lyra's quarters slid shut with a soft hiss, sealing her away from the political theater of the council chambers. She stood there for a moment, back pressed against the cool metal, and let out a laugh that started as a chuckle, and grew into something that would have made the assembled delegates considerably more nervous had they heard it. "Oh, Duchess," she said, looking at the orange tabby who had abandoned her grooming routine to stare at her human with the kind of patient expectation that cats had perfected over millennia of domestication. "They have no idea what they've just done." Duchess blinked slowly. That universal cat gesture that could mean anything from "I love you" to "I'm plotting your demise" to "There's a bug on the ceiling that's been bothering me for the last hour." In this case, Lyra was fairly certain it meant, "Tell me about it while you open a can of that salmon stuff." Lyra pushed off from the door and walked to the small kitchenette that occupied one corner of her quarters. The space was cramped by human standards, luxurious by spaceship standards, and absolutely palatial by cat standards, assuming you measured palatial by number of surfaces available for napping, rather than square footage. "Let me tell you something about apex predators, my furry friend," Lyra said, opening the storage compartment that held Duchess's supplies. Inside sat everything a well-traveled cat could need: food, toys, grooming supplies, a portable litter box that had been a triumph of human engineering, and, most importantly, official documentation proving that Duchess was, according to Earth's Department of Interstellar Pet Transportation, a registered emotional support animal. The irony of that last bit never failed to amuse Lyra. She opened a pouch of what the packaging optimistically called Cosmic Salmon Delight, and spooned it into Duchess's bowl. The cat approached with the measured dignity of royalty, approaching a tribute offering, sniffed delicately, and began to eat with the kind of focused intensity that most species reserved for matters of life and death. "You know," Lyra continued, settling into the chair beside the viewport and watching the stars wheel slowly past, "I should probably explain to you how we got here. Not that you care, of course. You've always been magnificently indifferent to the broader implications of your existence." Duchess paused in her eating long enough to give Lyra a look that clearly said, "Yes, and your point is?" It had been 8 months since Lyra first encountered Duchess, though at the time the cat hadn't been called Duchess. She'd been called "that damn cat" by the salvage crew that found her aboard the derelict cargo vessel drifting 3 light-years from the Proxima Station trade routes. The ship had been empty except for its automated systems and one small orange tabby who had somehow survived in the cargo bay for weeks, subsisting on spilled grain and whatever small vermin had also been aboard. When the salvage team found her, she'd been thin but alert, wary but not feral, and possessed of the kind of survival instincts that had kept her alive when everything else on the ship had failed. "The moment I saw you," Lyra said, watching Duchess methodically work through her dinner, "I knew you were something special. Not because you were particularly beautiful, though you are in your own orange, slightly judgmental way, but because you had survived. Against all odds, in a situation that should have killed you, you had not only survived, but maintained your dignity." Duchess finished eating and sat back to begin the post-meal grooming ritual that all cats considered essential to continued existence. The adoption process had been surprisingly simple. The salvage crew was happy to offload responsibility for the cat to someone who actually wanted her. The station's veterinary services had pronounced her healthy after a thorough examination and a round of vaccinations that had resulted in Duchess expressing her displeasure by hiding under Lyra's bunk for 3 days. Naming her had been more challenging. The cat had clearly never responded to human calls before. She'd been someone's pet, but either the original owners hadn't been particularly vocal, or she'd simply decided that human names were beneath her notice. So Lyra had tried various options: Stella, Nova, Cosmos, Nebula. Nothing had gotten more than a polite flick of an ear. Then one day, while Lyra was reviewing diplomatic protocols for her upcoming assignment to the Galactic Council, she'd looked up to see the cat, sitting in a shaft of starlight, back straight, head high, looking for all the world like some feline aristocrat holding court. "Duchess," she'd said, and the cat had turned to look at her with what could only be described as approval. The name had stuck. "The thing is," Lyra continued, settling back in her chair as Duchess moved on to grooming her left front paw with the methodical precision of a brain surgeon, "I don't think Councillor Vextar and his reptilian committee understand what they're asking for. They want to see Earth's apex predator. They think they're going to get some massive, snarling beast with claws and fangs and a really impressive roar." She paused, watching Duchess work on the space between her toes with the kind of focused attention that most beings reserved for complex mathematical equations. "They have no idea that they're about to meet one of the most successful predators in Earth's history. A creature whose species has conquered every continent except Antarctica. And honestly, that's just because they haven't figured out how to make penguins comfortable with the whole being hunted thing yet." The door chime interrupted her monologue, followed immediately by a voice that Lyra recognized as belonging to Emmett, the ship's xenobiologist, and one of the few humans aboard who had both a functioning sense of humor and enough security clearance to know what her real mission entailed. "Lyra?" Are you in there planning something that's going to get us all thrown out of an airlock? Come in, she called, and the door slid open to admit a tall, lanky man whose hair looked like he'd been running his fingers through it for the past several hours. Which, knowing Emmett, he probably had. I just heard about what happened in the council chambers, he said, stepping inside and letting the door close behind him. Please tell me you have a plan that doesn't involve actually bringing a tiger or something equally likely to eat important alien dignitaries. Lyra gestured to Duchess, who had finished with her paw, and moved on to her tale. Meet Earth's apex predator. Emmett stared at the cat. Duchess stared back, with the kind of regal indifference that made it clear she found him adequate, but not particularly interesting. That's a house cat, Emmett said slowly. Indeed she is. Lyra, I don't know if you've noticed, but Duchess weighs maybe 4 kilograms and spends most of her time sleeping in sunbeams and judging our life choices. All accurate observations, Lyra agreed cheerfully. Emmett rubbed his temples with the gesture of a man who'd had this kind of conversation before and suspected he was about to have it again. Okay, I'll bite. How exactly is a house cat going to convince the Galactic Council that humanity deserves membership? Lyra stood and walked to her desk, pulling out a data pad and tossing it to Emmett. Do a little reading. I'll make coffee. Emmett caught the pad and began scrolling through the information displayed on its screen. His expression shifted from confusion to interest, to something approaching alarm as he read. These statistics can't be right, he said after a few minutes. Which ones? All of them. According to this, house cats are responsible for the deaths of billions of birds annually. Billions, Lyra. And that's just on Earth. Keep reading. They've contributed to the extinction of at least 63 species of birds, mammals, and reptiles. His voice was rising slightly. In Australia alone, they kill more than 2 billion native animals every year. 2 billion. Lyra, this says that the ecological impact of domestic cats is so severe that they're considered one of the world's worst invasive species by conservation biologists. And yet, Lyra said, returning with 2 cups of coffee and settling back into her chair, humans continue to share their homes with roughly 600 million of them worldwide. Emmett looked from the data pad to Duchess, who had now settled into a perfect loaf position and was watching him with the serene expression of a creature entirely at peace with her place in the universe. You're going to argue that cats are actually terrifying predators, he said. I'm going to argue that cats are exactly what they've always been. Highly efficient, adaptable predators who have successfully convinced the dominant species on their planet to feed them, shelter them, and provide medical care in exchange for the occasional dead mouse and some purring. That's actually kind of brilliant. And here's the really beautiful part, Lyra continued, scratching behind Duchess's ears and earning a rumbling purr that seemed to vibrate through the entire chair. The Council expects me to bring them something that will demonstrate humanity's fear of our own world's apex predators. They're expecting me to show up with something caged, contained, controlled through superior technology and overwhelming force. Emmett was beginning to smile. But instead, you're going to walk in with a predator that we've domesticated so completely that it chooses to live with us. A predator, Lyra said, her own smile widening, that has trained humans to serve its every need, while simultaneously maintaining its independence, its hunting instincts, and its ability to survive without us if necessary. A predator that looks cute and harmless right up until the moment it decides something needs to die. Duchess chose that moment to stretch, extending claws that gleamed like tiny scimitars in the starlight before settling back into her loaf position as if nothing had happened. The psychological warfare aspect alone should be enough to give old Vextar nightmares, Emmett said, warming to the theme. What kind of species domesticates apex predators for companionship? The kind of species, Lyra said, standing and walking to the storage compartment where she kept Duchess's travel carrier, that understands predators so well that we've turned them into willing partners instead of conquered enemies. She pulled out the carrier, a standard-issue pet transport unit that looked about as threatening as a lunchbox, and set it on the floor. Duchess regarded it with the expression of a creature who had traveled enough to know that carriers meant adventure, but wasn't entirely sure she approved of the timing. Tomorrow, Lyra said, the Galactic Council is going to learn something about humanity that they weren't expecting. They're going to learn that our greatest strength isn't our technology, or our adaptability, or even our stubborn refusal to back down from a fight. She opened the carrier door and began arranging the soft bedding inside with the kind of care usually reserved for preparing a bed for visiting royalty. They're going to learn that our greatest strength is our ability to look at the most dangerous things in our world and say, yes, but have you considered that we could be friends instead? Duchess hopped down from the chair and approached the carrier, sniffing delicately at the entrance before stepping inside and settling down with the resigned dignity of a creature who had learned that sometimes humans got ideas, and the best way to deal with human ideas was with patience and the occasional strategic purr. Lyra sealed the carrier and sat back, looking at Emmett with the expression of someone who had just set in motion a plan so audacious that it bordered on the insane. "Get some sleep," she told him. "Tomorrow's going to be interesting." "Define interesting," Emmett said, though he was already heading for the door. "The kind of interesting that ends with either humanity's acceptance into the galactic community or all of us being politely asked to leave and never come back. And you're betting everything on a house cat." Lyra looked at the carrier, where Duchess had already settled in for a nap, with the confidence of a creature who had never doubted that everything would work out exactly as it should. "I'm betting everything," she said, "on what that house cat represents." The door slid shut behind Emmett, leaving Lyra alone with her thoughts and her sleeping predator. Outside the viewport, the stars continued their ancient dance, utterly indifferent to the machinations of the small beings who had learned to travel between them. But tomorrow, Lyra reflected, at least a few of those beings were going to get a lesson in the difference between appearances and reality. And Duchess, apex predator of Earth, slept peacefully in her carrier, dreaming whatever dreams came to creatures who had spent millions of years perfecting the art of being underestimated. The Galactic Council chamber had been transformed overnight into something resembling a gladiatorial arena crossed with a nature documentary set. Additional seating had been installed to accommodate what appeared to be every delegate, aide, secretary, and coffee-fetching intern in the entire station. The audio lighting had been adjusted to something the event coordinators probably called dramatic, and someone had installed what looked suspiciously like emergency medical stations around the perimeter. Lyra stood outside the chamber doors, carrier in hand, watching the preparations through the transparent aluminum viewing panels with the detached amusement of someone watching a particularly elaborate magic trick being set up. "They've even brought recording equipment," Emmett observed, joining her at the viewing window. "I think Plymouth is planning to sell this as a documentary. The day humanity met its match. Or something equally subtle." Lyra adjusted her grip on the carrier handle. Inside, Duchess was maintaining the kind of serene composure that came naturally to creatures who had spent their entire evolutionary history being underestimated right up until the moment they pounced. Any word on the betting pools? 3-to-1 odds that you don't make it out alive. 5-to-1 that whatever you brought kills at least one delegate. And there's apparently a side bet on whether Vextar actually wets himself when he sees Earth's apex predator. What are the odds on that last one? Even money. Lyra grinned. I should have put some credits down. The chamber doors slid open with a hiss that seemed unnecessarily dramatic. But then again, everything about this whole situation had crossed into the realm of unnecessary drama. Somewhere around the time the Galactic Council decided to judge an entire species based on their relationship with predators. The human delegation will present themselves, announced Plymouth's voice over the chamber's address system, crackling with the kind of nervous energy that suggested the insectoid had been mainlining whatever passed for caffeine in their species. Lyra stepped through the doorway and immediately had to suppress another laugh. The chamber was packed beyond capacity, with beings hanging from the ceiling, pressed against the walls, and in at least one case, hovering in what appeared to be a small personal cloud of glowing gas. She recognized delegates from dozens of species she'd studied during her preparation for this assignment, and at least a dozen more that were apparently so exotic they hadn't made it into the standard diplomatic briefings. At the center of it all, Councillor Vexitar sat in his elevated chair, like some sort of reptilian emperor, his scales gleaming under the dramatic lighting, and his eyes fixed on the small carrier in Lyra's hand, with the kind of anticipatory hunger usually reserved for particularly satisfying revenge fantasies. "Approach," he commanded, his voice carrying easily through the chamber's perfect acoustics. Lyra walked forward at an unhurried pace, her boots clicking against the polished floor in a rhythm that managed to sound both respectful and completely unimpressed. She stopped in the center of the chamber, set the carrier down carefully, and straightened to face the assembled masses with the kind of calm confidence that made several of the more observant delegates shift uncomfortably. "Esteemed members of the Galactic Council," she began, her voice pitched to carry without seeming to strain, "you have challenged humanity to demonstrate our relationship with the apex predators of our world. You wish to see the creature that sits at the very top of Earth's food chain, the being that represents the pinnacle of predatory evolution on our planet." A murmur ran through the assembled crowd, anticipation mixed with what sounded like barely contained excitement. Someone in the crystalline delegation actually started chiming a rhythm that the universal translator helpfully rendered as dramatic battle music. Vexitar leaned forward in his chair, tongue flicking out to taste what he probably imagined was the scent of human fear. "Indeed. Show us this fearsome beast that humanity trembles before." Lyra nodded gravely and knelt beside the carrier. "Before I do, I feel it's important to establish some context. Earth, as you know, is what we call a death world, a planet where evolution has produced creatures of extraordinary lethality and predatory efficiency." She began working the latches on the carrier with deliberate slowness, building the tension like a magician preparing for the grand reveal. "Our oceans contain predators that can sense electrical impulses from miles away and bite with a force of over 4,000 pounds per square inch. Our land masses are home to creatures that can run at speeds exceeding 60 miles per hour and bring down prey 10 times their size. Our skies are patrolled by hunters with telescopic vision and talons capable of crushing bone." The chamber had fallen completely silent. Even the gas cloud entity had stopped its rhythmic pulsing. "But the creature I'm about to show you," Lyra continued, her fingers working the final latch, represents something far more significant than raw power or impressive hunting statistics. This creature embodies the relationship between humanity and the predators of our world. A relationship that I believe will surprise you. The carrier door swung open with a soft click. For a moment, nothing happened. Then Duchess emerged with the kind of measured dignity that suggested she was perfectly aware she was making an entrance and wanted to make sure it was appropriately dramatic. The silence that followed was so complete that Lyra could hear the hum of the chamber's environmental systems. Duchess sat down, wrapped her orange tail around her front paws, and surveyed the assembled masses with the serene expression of a creature evaluating whether any of them looked particularly interesting. The silence stretched, and stretched. And then, like a dam bursting, the chamber erupted. "That's a house cat," shrieked something that looked like an ambulatory tree branch. "A domestic pet," gurgled the octopus philosopher, tentacles writhing with what could have been outrage or possibly just intense confusion. "This is an insult." The crystalline beings were chiming so frantically they sounded like wind chimes in a hurricane. An absolute mockery of the Council's authority. Vexitar rose from his chair with such force that he knocked over a ceremonial goblet, sending some sort of purple liquid cascading down the front of his robes. "Human, you dare to present this harmless creature as your world's apex predator?" Lyra let the outrage wash over her like rain, maintaining her position beside Duchess with the calm of someone watching a particularly entertaining tantrum. When the noise finally died down enough for her to be heard, she smiled. "Harmless," she said, her voice cutting through the remaining murmurs like a blade. "Councillor Vexitar, I think you may want to reconsider that assessment." She gestured to Duchess, who had remained completely unmoved by the chaos around her and was now engaged in the important task of grooming her left front paw. This creature represents a species that kills between 1 and 4 billion birds annually on Earth alone. Not for survival, they're well fed by their human companions. Not for territory, they live in heated homes with regular medical care. They kill because they are predators, and predators hunt. A few of the delegates stopped their outraged chittering. Her species has contributed to the extinction of at least 63 species of birds, mammals, and reptiles that we know of. In Australia, they kill over 2 billion native animals every year. They are considered by our conservation biologists to be one of the most destructive invasive species on the planet. More silence now, as the mathematical implications began to sink in. "But here's the fascinating part," Lyra continued, reaching down to scratch behind Duchess's ears. The cat immediately began purring, a sound that vibrated through the chamber's acoustics and somehow managed to sound both soothing and vaguely ominous. Despite being one of the most efficient killing machines our planet has ever produced, this creature chooses to live with humans. Not as our prisoner, not as our slave, but as our partner. Vexitar was staring at Duchess with a new expression, one that suggested he was beginning to reevaluate his assumptions. "Partner?" he said slowly. "Oh, yes. You see, Counselor, this is where things get really interesting." Lyra's smile widened. "Duchess here, and the 600 million others like her, have entered into what you might call a mutually beneficial arrangement with humanity. We provide food, shelter, medical care, and entertainment. In exchange, they provide companionship, pest control, and the occasional dead bird as a gift." She paused, letting that sink in. "But here's the truly remarkable part. They could leave at any time. Unlike your typical domesticated species, cats retain all of their hunting instincts, their independence, and their ability to survive without us. They choose to stay because they've figured out something that apparently escaped the attention of this council. Which is, Vextar's voice had lost most of its earlier confidence, that the smartest predators don't fight the dominant species on their planet. They form alliances with them. Duchess finished grooming her paw and looked up at the assembled delegates with the kind of patient regard usually reserved for slow students who were finally beginning to grasp a simple concept. "Let me give you another way to think about this," Lyra said, beginning to pace around Duchess in a slow circle. "You've all been operating under the assumption that apex predators are large, obvious, heavily armed creatures that dominate through fear and superior firepower. But what if that's not actually the most successful evolutionary strategy?" She gestured to Duchess, who had now settled into a classic loaf position and was watching the proceedings with the air of someone attending a moderately interesting lecture. "What if the most successful predators are the ones that look harmless, the ones that other species underestimate right up until the moment they strike? The ones that are so good at what they do that they've convinced the dominant species on their planet to actively help them hunt?" A new murmur was running through the assembly now, not outrage, but something that sounded suspiciously like nervous realization. Consider this. When Duchess hunts, she doesn't just rely on her own considerable skills. She has access to human transportation systems that can take her anywhere on the planet. She has access to human communication networks that can coordinate with other hunters. She has access to human medical technology that keeps her healthy and at peak efficiency. And she has access to human reproductive support that has allowed her species to populate literally every habitable continent on Earth. Vexitar had gone very still. "You're suggesting that these house cats have weaponized human civilization?" "I'm suggesting," Lyra said, "that they've done something far more impressive than that. They've formed a partnership with the species that conquered their planet so complete that most humans genuinely believe they're the ones who domesticated cats, rather than the other way around." She reached into her jacket and pulled out a datapad, holding it up for the assembly to see. "Here are some statistics that might interest you. On Earth, humans spend approximately 100 billion credits annually on pet cats. We provide them with specialized food, entertainment, medical care, and living accommodations. We clean up their waste. We transport them when they need to travel. We provide breeding programs to ensure genetic diversity. And when they die, we mourn them and often acquire new ones to take their place." The silence in the chamber was now absolute. "In exchange," Lyra continued, "they provide us with companionship and the occasional dead rodent. From an economic perspective, this is possibly the most one-sided trade agreement in the history of interspecies relations." She looked around the chamber, meeting the eyes of delegates who were beginning to look distinctly uncomfortable. "But here's the question that should really keep you up at night. If this is what humanity's relationship looks like with a predator that weighs 4 kilograms and spends most of its time sleeping in sunbeams, what do you think our relationship looks like with the predators who weigh 80 kilograms and have opposable thumbs?" Duchess chose that moment to stand up, stretch in a way that displayed those scimitar claws to full advantage, and then settle back down with a yawn that revealed teeth that looked considerably more impressive under the chamber's dramatic lighting than they had any right to. Vexitar was no longer looking confident. In fact, he was looking like someone who had just realized that he'd been playing chess while his opponent had been playing four-dimensional warfare. "You're saying," he said slowly, "that humans are the apex predators of your world?" Lyra's smile was now definitely predatory. Counselor Vextar, humans don't just dominate our world's apex predators. We've convinced them to live in our homes and purr when we scratch behind their ears. The chamber erupted into chaos once again, but this time it wasn't outrage. This time it sounded suspiciously like panic. Lyra waited for the chaos to die down, one hand resting gently on Duchess's back, as the cat continued her post-stretch grooming routine with the kind of methodical precision that suggested the fate of galactic diplomacy was considerably less important than achieving perfect fur alignment. "But wait," she said, her voice cutting through the remaining panic like a scalpel through tissue. "There's more." The chamber fell silent so quickly it was almost comical. Vexitar gripped the arms of his chair with claws that had emerged without his conscious permission, and Plymoux's clicking had reached frequencies that were probably causing structural damage to the recording equipment. "You see, the relationship I've described between humans and cats represents just the beginning of our approach to apex predators." Lyra began walking in a slow circle around Duchess, who had now achieved perfect loaf configuration and was regarding the assembly with the serene confidence of a creature that had never doubted the outcome of this particular performance. "We also share our homes with the descendants of pack hunters that once terrorized early human settlements. We call them dogs, and there are currently over 900 million of them living as our companions, protectors, and in some cases, co-workers." Several delegates made sounds that the universal translator diplomatically rendered as nervous gulping. "We've domesticated creatures that can crush our bones with their jaws and convince them to play fetch with our children. We've taken predators that hunt in coordinated packs and trained them to herd our livestock, guide our blind, and detect explosives." Duchess chose this moment to demonstrate her own predatory capabilities by suddenly focusing with laser intensity on something invisible to everyone else in the chamber. Her pupils dilated, her body went perfectly still, and for a moment, every being in the room could see exactly what she was: a perfectly designed killing machine temporarily disguised as a fluffy companion. Then, whatever had caught her attention apparently moved beyond her interest threshold, and she went back to being a sleepy house cat. "But here's the truly terrifying part," Lyra continued, her voice dropping to just above a whisper, forcing everyone to strain to hear her words. "Everything I've told you about cats and dogs represents humanity's relationship with predators we consider safe enough to let sleep in our children's bedrooms." Vextar had gone completely pale, which was an impressive feat for a creature with green scales. "The predators we actually respect," Lyra said. "We put in zoos and nature preserves. We study them, protect them, and ensure their survival even when they occasionally eat our tourists, because we understand something fundamental about predators that apparently escaped this council's attention." She stopped walking and faced Vextar directly. "We understand that the most dangerous predator is the one that doesn't need to prove how dangerous it is," Duchess purred. The sound echoed through the chamber's acoustics, and somehow, in that moment, it sounded less like contentment and more like the satisfied rumble of something that had just finished a particularly successful hunt. "I believe," Vextar said, his voice barely audible, "that humanity's application for council membership should be expedited." "Unanimously approved," squeaked Plymoux. Lyra picked up Duchess and the carrier. "Excellent. We look forward to working with you all." As she walked toward the exit, Duchess looked back over Lyra's shoulder at the assembled delegates, blinked slowly once, that universal cat gesture of supreme confidence, and then settled in for a nap. After all, conquering the galaxy was exhausting work, but somebody had to do it.